It is my proud privilege now to invite on stage Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhyay, former Indian ambassador to Afghanistan, Syria, and Myanmar. Ambassador, request you to join me here. We also have with us Colonel Rahmani, a former Afghan military aviation pilot, and Ambassador Hussain Haqqani. Ambassador Haqqani is Pakistan's former ambassador to the United States. He's an author. Now we know how dangerous the situation is in Afghanistan. The question is how to navigate this dangerous minefield. Now, a part of this session is virtual. I have Ambassador Mukhopadhyay with me here. In a moment, we'll also be joined by Colonel Rahmani and Ambassador Hussain Haqqani on this part of the show. Let me join you there. So we have Colonel Rahmani and Ambassador Hussain Haqqani joining us in just a moment, but you heard the session with General Petraeus. Very, very tense situation in Afghanistan. There's been a bomb attack recently. There have been many, many casualties. In your appreciation, did democracies let down Afghanistan?
One word, yes. I think you talked about a bomb blast today. I happened to be in Afghanistan just at the inauguration of the post-Bonn dispensation. In fact, the Bonn meeting hadn't yet taken place. The atmosphere was calm, if subdued, because it was during Ramzan. And the first gunfire I heard was only when the Eid celebrations took place and the Bonn Agreement Accord had come about. Contrast that to the inauguration of Taliban 2.0, as people call it. It has begun with a bomb blast at the Kabul airport, which was under security cover of the Haqqani network, which was taking care of security in Kabul itself. And after that, we've had several attacks in Jalalabad and elsewhere, and this one, of course, being the latest. So even if we just contrast the beginnings, there is a big descent, a big downward spiral in violence that doesn't augur very well for the future.
Ambassador Haqqani, welcome on India Today. Good to have you on the show with us. In your view, Ambassador Haqqani, is this a victory for Pakistan, as some argue?
Well, I have already said that it is a Pyrrhic victory for Pakistan. Pakistan has single-mindedly focused on security vis-a-vis India. And in that, they supported the Taliban all these years. They would argue that they were not supporting them, they were just recognizing a reality on ground, and the victory of the Taliban reflects that reality. But we all know that the Taliban would not have managed to survive without their leadership having some measure of safety in Pakistan, without their fighters getting healthcare and treatment in Pakistan, and without them crossing the border even after it has been fenced. So Pakistan has both a very huge stake in Afghanistan, and it also has a responsibility. It has won in a way, but it is not being able to manage its victory. All we are hearing from Islamabad are calls for the international community to recognize the Taliban or engage with the Taliban without the Taliban changing their behavior. And that is not good for Pakistan's credibility. If Pakistan takes responsibility for the Taliban, then it has to use both positive and negative incentives, which means it should also pressure the Taliban into changing their conduct. And it is not able to do so. On the other hand, the negative side for Pakistan is going to be enormous. The international community will continue to hold Pakistan responsible for events in Afghanistan. And the more Pakistan says, well, we might have supported the Taliban, but we do not control the Taliban, the less Pakistan's credibility will become internationally. And lastly, Pakistan will become a victim of terrorism once again. The TTP, the Pakistani Taliban, are active as well. Now, there was a time when Pakistan blamed the TTP's existence on its traditional rival India, and now they can't say that because, after all, there is no Indian presence in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. So if the TTP is still attacking in Pakistan, Pakistan has to worry about it. So yes, the answer to your question, it is a victory, but it is a Pyrrhic victory.
I will come to the aspect of TTP because we've been told that after Taliban took over Kabul post 15th of August, apparently there have been between 70 to 90 Pakistani fatalities along the Afpak border. But I'll come to that aspect in just a moment. But Colonel Rahmani, now that I have your link back, Why did the Afghan army and air force not fight back? You had the weapons. Did you lack the will, sir?
Gotham, I think it was not, let's not put the blame on one party. It was a shared responsibility. Some up to 46 nations were involved in Afghanistan in the last 20 years, including our neighbors and regional allies. So I think it was this debacle is the result of many failures. It's not just one party.
Did America decide, Ambassador Mukhopadhyay, on their own one day that they're pulling out, did not take partners into confidence, or did they realize 20 years, enough is enough, now they're on their way out? In a way, is Pakistan now going to decide Afghanistan's future sooner than later?
Well, you know,
The mic, sir.
I don't think the United States pulled out from one day to another. I think the preparations for this have begun as far back as when President Obama announced his surge and drawdown. That was already a sign of preparation. And I think subsequent to that, even the 2018, meeting between Alice Wells and the Taliban in Doha, that actually set the process for the departure. What was clear is that the United States had decided to withdraw, that it had enough of the Afghan headache, that it was even willing to sort of cut short the guarantees that it wanted in terms of Al-Qaeda and security, and was willing to make actually a fairly loose deal with the Taliban. And it probably also calculated that it had been providing for practically 20 years net security for its principal strategic rivals globally and in the region, that is China, Russia, and Iran, who all enjoyed the protection from radicalism, from extremism, and from the Taliban, while the US troops were there. So I think this was something that they decided, and they should have really anticipated the consequences. So I'm not so sure it is just purely accidental what we are seeing, or it is something that they anticipated. My suspicion is that to some extent, to the extent that they projected people like Sirajuddin Haqqani and Anas Haqqani, I think the kind of free pass that they gave to Taliban, the whitewashing of the Taliban into good Taliban and bad Taliban, and the stacking of the decks, both in the battlefield and in the diplomatic table, that occurred through the entire Doha process, suggested that in some ways they facilitated and enabled the return of the Taliban to Afghanistan, maybe partly to destabilize precisely their strategic rivals over all these years.
So, destabilize their strategic rivals, Ambassador Haqqani, would indicate destabilize Pakistan, and through Pakistan, China. Is that what you foresee happen already in the coming years? I mean, we're seeing some military casualties on the Afghan border. Would China also face some heat in the rest of Xinjiang region?
I think that Ambassador Mukhopadhyay is actually attributing to Americans a way of thinking that is just not American. They are not necessarily long-term thinkers. And I agree with him that they wanted to get out of Afghanistan all the way from 2008. In fact, I started my term as ambassador of Pakistan to the United States in 2008. And Pakistan's military leadership understood that the Americans are not going to stay in Afghanistan forever. The problem was that if they had started planning in 2008 for 2021, then there would have been something that would have been a serious plan, including the kind of things that Ambassador Mukhopadhyay is talking about having a strategic objective vis-a-vis China and Russia. I think America had a one-year plan each year for the last 20 years for Afghanistan. It was just not strategically important enough for the best American strategic minds to devote energies to Afghanistan. For example, the ambassador cited Alice Wells. She was an acting assistant secretary of state. Sending her to talk to the Taliban rather than somebody who reflected a bigger strategic view of things basically showed that this was bureaucratic inertia. We need to get out. Okay, the clock is running out on us, and the political masters want us to get out, so let us get out. So there was no grand plan, which is why the Americans are now scrambling to try and put together a grand plan. Will there be consequences? Of course there will be consequences. I think Pakistan will be destabilized, and Pakistan is concerned about it. That is why Pakistan wants the world to support their endeavor in Afghanistan, without understanding that that's not how the world works. On the other hand, I think the Chinese are going to try and insulate themselves from radical Islamism by cutting some kind of a deal with the Taliban. Look, the Mujahideen, when they were fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan, at that moment, the Americans had a deal with global Islamist movements that the global Islamist movements will face communism before they actually do anything about America. And there was a kind of hubris that they will never come after us, even though the Islamist movements, books, and literature always talked about two evils, communism and Western capitalist democracy. When Al-Qaeda, etc., organized and said, okay, now we are going to do our second part of our global struggle, then again, there was hubris that this is a minor thing that can be handled with some cruise missiles shot out of ships in the Arabian Sea or the Persian Gulf. So the Americans have never had a long-term plan, and I'm afraid they still do not have a long-term plan to deal with radical Islamist extremism.
Okay, I'll get you to respond to that, but I just want to bring in Colonel Rahmani for a moment, because Colonel Rahmani, if the Americans had a long-term plan, that would indicate that Afghan National Defense Forces, the Afghan government, whether initially Hamid Karzai or subsequently Ashraf Ghani, there was time to prepare. Did you think that the Americans will one day leave Afghanistan? Maybe not so suddenly, maybe not in the manner in which they just left lock, stock, and barrel, but should there not have been preparations in Afghanistan for an eventuality post the American withdrawal?
Well, yes. We anticipated this, not in the manner it happened, but we were getting ready from 2012 and on, especially 2014, when a majority of US and coalition forces left Afghanistan. Afghan security forces took the responsibility of, conducting operations independently, even night raids and night missions. To your previous question, Afghan security forces actually fought. We gave more than 75,000 casualties, and ultimate sacrifice. I remember we were 36 students when we went to London in 2009 for flight engineer and pilot training, and the group of us, we went also to the United States for pilot training. Out of that 36 people, only 7 left. Two of them live in Canada, 2 in the United States. One is still in Afghanistan. But the majority of the rest were killed. I have seen my friends gone in the combat during the missions.
But do we now look at a scenario where there will be civil war in Afghanistan, Ambassador Mukhopadhyay? Is that going to happen? There is a humanitarian crisis. People won't have food. There's no electricity. It's going to be extremely cold. Will aid come in, and will this aid be channeled through Pakistan, or because the Taliban do not have the infrastructure, they do not have the means to ensure that aid goes to everyone, or will they use food as a weapon in the months ahead?
Well, they've already used food as a weapon in the Panjshir campaign. So, I think this whole question, I think the humanitarian crisis, the importance of the humanitarian situation, the economic situation as well, is actually a top priority right now. We cannot just bear to see, as the Afghan winter, the very harsh Afghan winter sets in, that 3.5 million people who have been displaced by drought, another perhaps at least 500,000 displaced, internally displaced just by the conflict, should be able to suffer. And you are absolutely right. You know, the Taliban cabinet at this stage, I can't even call it a government, simply does not have the structures of administration to be able to do this. And also there are grave doubts about the impartiality with which it would distribute this. So I would say that there is an alternative route that we have used before, which is that there are specialized multilateral UN organizations that have been involved in the distribution of food. In 2002, when we donated 1 million tons of wheat to Afghanistan, initially it was routed through Pakistan. Pakistan then stopped it. We converted it into high-protein biscuits through the WFP, and it was distributed all over Afghanistan into the interiors through the WFP with the Indian flag and the WFP logo, and it was a very successful mission. So there are ways of addressing this, and you know, in a situation of a humanitarian crisis, if the Taliban cabinet decides to play politics with food and with medicines and with humanitarian assistance, well, it will face the consequences for it. So I think there is a route available.
But will it just be the Afghanistan cabinet or the Taliban cabinet or Ambassador Haqqani? Will strings still be pulled from Apara, from the ISI headquarters in Pakistan? The fact that you had General Faiz Hamid, at the Serena Hotel in Kabul, is that picture symbolic of Pakistan's role in Afghanistan then and in the times ahead, sir?
Look, Pakistan and Afghanistan are tied at the hip. We all know that. Historically, parts of Pakistan and parts of Afghanistan were governed together. There is a ethnic group, the Pashtuns, that overlaps. There are more Pashtuns in Pakistan than there are in Afghanistan, but the Pashtuns are supposed to be the largest ethnic group in Afghanistan. The border has been porous for centuries, if not for decades. There are tribes that live on both sides of the border. So obviously Pakistan has a significant role in Afghanistan. Now, over the last 4 or 5 decades, that role has, at the government level in Pakistan, been handled by the Pakistani Inter-Services Intelligence. And while there is a great temptation on the part of many people to just blame everything on the ISI and to blame everything on Pakistan, the fact of the matter is that the reality is always far more complex. Pakistan is not, and I've been a critic of Pakistani policy on Afghanistan because I think Pakistan should respect Afghanistan's sovereignty and let Afghans decide their matters instead of choosing favorites, and choosing extreme Islamists as favorites is never a good idea for Pakistan's international policy. But that said, I think Pakistan has never interfered with the flow of humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan, even in the worst of circumstances. So I don't think that they will. Will they? As Ambassador Mukhpadir rightly pointed out, will they sometimes say, well, no Indian assistance? That is, of course, a compulsion of their extreme view, which people like me have disagreed with, that India is an eternal enemy of Pakistan. So that will be a factor as far as Indian assistance goes. But the rest of the international community, I think, will assist Afghanistan with humanitarian aid, and Pakistan will let that go through. And I don't think even the Taliban will play politics with that because they desperately need their assistance. We must remember, even the Ghani government, under the Ghani government, 80% of Afghanistan's GDP had its roots in external funding and support and assistance. So I don't think that the Taliban are going to stop humanitarian assistance either. And my own view is that the world needs to create a sanctions regime that sanctions the Taliban, but does not put the burden of the sanctions on the people of Afghanistan, who do deserve to get food and medicine and any other humanitarian help that they can get from the international community till either the Taliban change, of which we see no sign, or the government in Afghanistan changes.
In fact, I was coming to the point of sanctions, but let me bring in Colonel Rahmani. Will Taliban use food or food aid as a weapon? There are reports already that they're going after some of your brothers in arms, those who fought for the Afghan National Forces. They're going after the fighters in Panjshir. Will Taliban use food as a weapon, especially when this harsh winter approaches, sir?
Exactly, that's what they have been doing in the last 20 years. That's part of their larger policy to impose their will on the people. I have been involved in this evacuation process, let me bring some pressing concerns in regards to that. You know, as you said, the Taliban are going door to door after former Afghan security forces, former government officials, and also some journalists and human rights and women rights activists. Um, you know, I was and I wanted to bring this issue because it's more important to look ahead than what happened, you know, because what happened we don't have control over, but what can happen we do have control over, and I think in a collective manner we can do a lot. From the people I have been helping. Um, I can give you some references. You know, we have 3,600 women who served in Afghan military, and their lives are in great danger. We have around 300 to 400 Afghan pilots and flight engineers still in Afghanistan, hiding, you know, in places in Afghanistan, and they need to be evacuated. We have a lot of journalists and women activists who remain in the country. We have some pilots and flight engineers in our neighbor Tajikistan, in our neighbor country Tajikistan, and
You're
among them.
absolutely right. We are hearing these reports, and these are very, very alarming reports of Taliban going door to door, house to house, hunting for people who are a part of the earlier regime, and in some cases, neutralizing them, eliminating them. But that's the question. How do you ensure that when you're negotiating this minefield, the road ahead is safer? And Ambassador Haqqani, some have argued that why just sanctions against the Taliban? Those who were handling the Taliban, there should be sanctions against them. You know, sanctions against perhaps the military leadership of Pakistan. And in your view, would that work?
I think that sanctions historically have only worked when the parties which are sanctioned are relatively weak. I do not think that China will ever agree to sanctions against Pakistan, which is why that is a route that has never been taken. And as an emotional demand, it's a great demand, but just do not see the international circumstances in which that demand is going to be heard by anyone. So I think the alternative route needs to be taken, which is very interestingly, the same thing that Pakistan wants the world to do with Afghanistan should actually be tried with Pakistan. The international community needs to engage with Pakistan and make it an important point to try and see if we can get Pakistan to change. As far as sanctions are concerned, if somebody can make them work, good luck to them.
Sir, you say engage with Pakistan at a time, Ambassador Mukhopadhyay, when the US president refuses to call Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan, despite repeated threats, if I may, coax, cajole threat from the US, from the Pakistani Foreign Minister and the National Security Advisor. So what's the message that the United States is sending to Pakistan, and is it lost in translation?
You know, I think sort of the days when Pakistan could quite easily milk the United States are surely over. Now, all through the US establishment, I think there's deep suspicion about Pakistan. There was a great deal of dependence on Pakistan for the prosecution of the war in Afghanistan. I think that is now more or less off. Even if they were to want help for over-the-horizon assistance or humanitarian assistance, this would be of a far lower degree and caliber that it was in the past. Of course, there are larger strategic issues. In the larger strategic issues, perhaps the US has some interest in keeping Pakistan engaged and not letting it become completely sort of subservient to China. And I think one should appreciate those considerations as well. But for the time being, I don't see any real prospects of a kind of strategic relationship of the kind that we had in the past, growing between Pakistan and the United States. In fact, Pakistan will remain pretty much in the shadows, in the negative shadows of the United States for some time, even as part of this overall, sort of geopolitics of the region.
And Ambassador Haqqani, in your view?
I agree with Ambassador Madhya on that the days of US-Pakistan bonhomie are gone. I think the US will not go back to becoming a strategic partner with Pakistan. There will be a transactional relationship. But when I say that the international community needs to engage with Pakistan, I have a slightly different thing in mind, and that is that instead of an engagement in which you give in to what the other side wants, you actually engage with the intention of trying to tell them that what you are asking for is not acceptable to us. And I think we are already getting there. If you see the tone, say, for example, of Deputy Secretary Wendy Sherman, both in Delhi and in Islamabad, it was very different from what it used to be in the past. And I agree with Ambassador Mukherjee that America's need of Pakistan has diminished, which will change its attitude. But this is going to be a longer term phenomenon than, say, for example, a lot of television anchors in India would like to see.
Okay, I have run out of time on this part of the show, but many thanks, many thanks, Colonel Rahmani, Ambassador Hussain Haqqani, and Ambassador Mukherjee for joining me here for this session of the India Today Conclave. There's no denying the fact that people in Afghanistan require aid, and perhaps the world needs to come together and provide that. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.